fuss as possible today, but we have to say goodbye to him, and we cannot do this without paying tribute both to his achievements and to the man that he was. Herbert was not a religious man. He thought people should work things out for themselves. So his ceremony today is a humanist one. It's an honour and a privilege for me to lead this ceremony for such a remarkable man. Pat and Mervyn have chosen the music from among Herbert's many favourites. We have put together a ceremony that we hope is as Herbert would have wanted. While some of you will be used to a very different type of ceremony, I hope you'll all be able to say goodbye to Herbert in your own way here today. Death is of the order of things. It follows life as naturally as night follows day. Herbert has lived such a long life, 104 years. To some of you, he's always been there. It must be hard to believe that he's no longer with us. Your memories of him will never be lost. They will be his best memorial. You will always be glad and proud that you've known him. And now, Herbert's grandson, Adrian, is going to say a few words about his grandfather.
Not a big one for making speeches, so I've got a few notes here. I'll try and muddle through. I think if one of the worst things about losing your grandfather is that you have to make a speech, then perhaps you've got your values wrong. This type of service is the right sort of thing. He didn't want a big service. He said, "Don't be sad." So hopefully we can get through this without being too tearful. He was very much a man of science. A lot of the communications that Mother's had in the last few days and weeks have expressed a lot of sadness from the sort of academic community and the community of people he worked with. He had a very interesting career, which we're going to hear something about a bit later on. I didn't really know him at that stage. Funnily enough, he retired in September 1972, which was nearly 40 years ago now, which is just the sort of time I started at boarding school, so I didn't really know much about his working life. He's presumably a man at the United Kingdom Atomic Energy Authority, who was so far signed 475 pension cheques, which is quite a lot really, so he did pretty well out of his pension, I would think. That's something which it's at least a plus. I would imagine that while he was working, he was very much the sort of mad professor. From the way that I knew him, I can imagine that he would have spent a lot of time in the corner of a lab. Perhaps some of you would know that. Sort of working by himself. Not necessarily the mad professor who's looking for world domination, but certainly working on his own little projects. I used to spend half terms with my grandparents, for which I've always been very grateful. That was a time for me to get away from the regimented life that it was at boarding school, and enjoy a bit of, well, I suppose, love to some extent, because it was away from school, but also to look at different things, to investigate electronics, which was his interest, and do things which I couldn't do at school. He had a workshop in his barn. This was before they moved down to Cornwall. This was in a cottage near Oxford where they lived. And that was his, I think to some extent that was his refuge to get away from the wife. It was very nice to her, certainly very nice to me, but it was somewhere that I don't think she ever ventured. place to go away and carry on his work, really. He made a lot of different things in there. The whole place was full of tobacco tins. He used to smoke a pipe, and all the tobacco tins were saved up and reused. And they had all sorts of things in there. And a lot of them, when you find them now, because they're still in the garage, have a little patch on the top that was used for mixing araldite when he was making things. The number of things he made with araldite was quite frightening. Those tins were full of screws and nuts and bolts and bits of metal and perspex and gold leaf and an extraordinary number of chemicals as well. I forgot to bring it actually, but there was a strange little vial that I found of some platinum chemical, which no idea what he was going to use it for. It's not really the sort of thing that you'd expect somebody to have at home, so it's a bit strange, huh? But he did things at home, and what we worked on during the time that I was with him was always of an interest to me, and something that, again, I should always be grateful for. I can remember after half-terms, returning back to school, most kids would turn up with tuck, chocolate and biscuits and that sort of thing. I remember one occasion going back with a couple of jars of peanut butter, all sets of peanut butter, but a cathode ray tube, which the old tubes used to put in a television, in essence, but a smaller version of that, which was something we used at school for quite a long time actually, because it's high voltage and it's relatively dangerous. And I'm sure that they wouldn't have been happy had they known about that. It's not really the sort of thing you want. Certainly these days, kids having in school. One of the things he spent a lot of his time doing was collecting weather information. He had a wooden case full of instruments in the house that he could monitor what was going on outside. There's one still in the house here in Cornwall. And he made everything himself. The anemometer, the wind vane, and rain gauge. These were all handmade, unique, tested, calibrated, and most of them worked for quite a long time. That was his sort of interest, his fascination. He used to use all the bits out of these tins for making these things. It's sad in a way that you can probably go down to Lidl and pay £50, £70 and get the whole set now complete. All that work has gone, and you end up with a completely different thing. He missed out on the digital revolution. He was very much a man before that happened. It's not something that he didn't embrace, because he had a CD player and a digital camera, but he didn't understand the digital world. It's something he never got to. Because these days, with that weather information, you could draw graphs on your computer, you could share it with other people, you could compare it with somebody on the other side of Plymouth. All that sort of possibility was completely lost on him. We did, my father would say this, there was a big argument once with the CD player, because if you remember in the paper, you sometimes get 3 CDs in the paper with offers, but they're CDs for using a computer, not for a player. And he could never understand why, when you put one of these CDs in the player, it didn't work. It didn't play a tune. He wouldn't accept that. That was just wrong. And he could simply never get around that. It's interesting that I work in digital electronics these days, and sorry, I'm getting a note from the director to move on. I work with digital electronics, and a lot of the issues that I deal with are very much the things that he would have understood, but just on a completely different scale. So it's interesting how the world has come full circle. Just one of the things he was very much known for was a bad memory. Not necessarily facts and geography. He was very good at some things. If you played Trivial Pursuit against him, you could have been in real trouble. But names were always a problem. And I've sort of inherited that to some extent. So if we talk afterwards, and you know that we've met, but I'm looking blank, that's probably why. So if I've inherited anything from him, apart from the memory, I would say it's his interest in science and his curiosity, for which I should always be grateful, and also the jacket. Thank you.
I didn't have the privilege of meeting Herbert, but talking to Pat has has given me a picture of his life. Herbert was born in Winsford, in Cheshire. His father was a chemist in the days when medicines were mixed and prepared in the shop. Whenever Herbert talked about his childhood, it was always in glowing terms. The family was one of the first in Cheshire to own a car, and they enjoyed many trips into Wales. Perhaps it was from his father that Herbert got his passion for technology. His father certainly helped him make a very early crystal radio set. When Herbert proudly took it back to school at Ashfield College to show his friends, it was confiscated. Not a suitable thing for a boy to play with. Herbert was always too much of an individual to enjoy team games at school, but he was the inspiration for the cycling club there. Cycling was a sport he could enjoy. Herbert had talked to friends who were at university, and hearing at about rag weeks and things like that, he decided that it wasn't for him. So his father arranged for him to be articled to a surveyor. He enjoyed going out to the different houses, but was probably not too upset when the surveyor went out of business and Herbert had to look for a different career. He went to London on his motorbike, one of 29 he built over his life. That was Herbert. If he wanted something, he built it. He never thought of buying it. In London, he first worked for Gray and Amplium in the forefront of the new technology in telephones, loudspeakers, and radio valves. Exciting times. Then he went on to work on the electrification of the tote. In 1932, he married Lillian. They had a daughter, Pat, but things did not work out, and in 1936, Herbert and Lillian were divorced. With the onset of war, Herbert went to work at the Malvern Radar Research Establishment. These days, we'd probably say he was headhunted for the research that proved vital to the winning of the war. In 1942, he married Mildred, and they were very happy together for 50 years. Pat was able to rejoin her father, and they lived at Malvern until the unit was disbanded in 1947. Herbert was offered work at Jodrell Bank, but chose instead the Harwell Atomic Energy Research Establishment. He worked in the Rutherford laboratory there on the Nimrod synchrotron, building accelerators that led eventually to the development of CERN. He was very much respected by his colleagues, one of whom described him as a real mentor. He held 5 patents for improvements to nuclear reactors. He was very modest about his work, saying he designed components in the laboratory, and these were mostly based on old tobacco tins. Indeed, he did adapt and reuse components wherever he could, and complained that Harwell would tell him he must use up his budget before the end of the financial year, or the government would reduce it next year. Outside work, he was still building, creating with technology. He made musical instruments, a bassoon, a clarinet. He built an electronic organ from the wreckage of 2 discarded church organs. The finished product was so big that when the family moved, they couldn't get it out of the house. When a car ran into the back of theirs, he rebuilt the boot with the mahogany from those same church organs. He designed and built the gardens of each house he lived in. He experimented with growing tobacco, but couldn't solve the problem of drying it. It hung on strings, going mouldy and smelling foul. In 1972, Herbert retired. He had more time for his painting. He was an accomplished artist, selling many of his paintings in the Porpero Gallery. He tried his hand at pottery, winemaking, and of course he was still inventing all kinds of gadgets. He continued with his gardening, but when the garden at Brightwell-cum-Sotwell became too difficult to manage, he and Mildred looked for somewhere smaller. They were delighted to learn that the house next door to Herbert's old friend from Malvern days, Sir Eric Denton, was for sale. So Herbert and Mildred came to live in St Germans. They were very happy there. Herbert's unfailing interest in anything and everything kept him going. He continued driving until just before his 100th birthday. He never lost his passion for technology. Even in his last years, with poor sight and hearing and limited mobility, he still loved to take things apart and put them back together. Independent and individual as ever, Herbert was determined to stay in his own home, which, with help from his carers, he was able to do until just 2 weeks before he died. Herbert was first and foremost a man of science. His career stretched over the huge technological advances of the 20th century, from the crystal radio set to nuclear physics. He was always his own man. He was a peacemaker, avoiding disagreements whenever he could. He wanted to believe the best of everyone. He could not believe that the junk mail people would write and tell him he'd won a prize if he had not. He loved to debate. He would even invite the Jehovah's Witnesses in, and once declared that he'd converted them. Perhaps he's best summed up in the words of his colleagues. Leo Hobbes, some years ago, said, "Herbert was and is magnificent." Frank James described him as quite brilliant. Now we're going to pause and listen to some music. It's an opportunity to reflect on your own special memories of Herbert. Those of you with religious beliefs might want to say a private prayer, or just enjoy the music. It's John Field's Nocturne in A minor. Major. Perhaps unexpectedly, Herbert was fond of poetry. He especially liked a verse written by Pat. It inspired one of his paintings. It's called Cornish Morning. The sun shines, winks among the leaves, dappling the pavement, patterning the eaves. Whitewashed walls gleam in the sun, blue door and window, red geranium. And now we come to the most solemn part of the ceremony, when we have to say a last goodbye to Herbert. Please stand for the committal. To everything there is a season, and a time to every purpose under heaven. A time to be born, and sadly, a time to die. Herbert, in sorrow, in love, and in appreciation, we say goodbye to you. May you rest in peace. Please be seated. lived a long and a full life. He's helped to advance science and has inspired others to do the same. His influence and his inspiration as a scientist and as a man will be passed on through the generations to come. In the going down of the sun and in the morning, we will remember him. In the blowing of the wind and the chill of the winter, we will remember him. In the opening of the buds and in the warmth of the summer, we will remember him. In the rustling of the leaves and the beauty of the autumn, we will remember him. Pat has asked me to thank Marcia for all the help and support she has given to Herbert, and all the staff from Oasis who made it possible for him to stay in his own home for so long, and the staff at the Elms for the care they gave him in his last weeks. Herbert asked that his ashes be placed on his mother's grave in Winsford, where Mildred's ashes already are. A ceremony will be held up there for family and friends in that part of the world. If you wish to make a donation in memory of Herbert, please give to the Cornwall Air Ambulance via the funeral directors, the Co-op in Saltash. On behalf of Pat, I'd like to invite you to join her after the ceremony at Heskin Mill to raise a glass to Herbert and share more memories of him. It's just off the A38 near the St Germans turnoff. We're going to leave today to Chanson de Nuit by Edward Elgar. Remember Herbert for the very special man that he was. Thank you all for coming.